Welcome to the original Gangsters Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein, and we are going to continue in what I'm going to make a trilogy in a series that I'm going to call Canadian Biker Boss Legends, Myths, and Mysteries. So the first installment was Nurget, Stadnick, Ontario, Hell's Angels takeover of the Golden Horseshoe, and kind of giving context and some insider details to the life and legacy of Walter Nurget Stadnick, who will play a role in all three of these videos. And Nurget Stadnick is, the biker god of all biker gods, has been in power as the national president of Canada, Hell's Angels, since 1988, and right now is probably the most powerful biker boss on the planet. And there's a real mystique around him. If Marty Robert is I call him the biker boss, James Bond 007, international man of mystery. Nurget Stadnick is Kaiser Soze, the mysterious villain pulling all the strings in the movie Usual Suspects. And in the next installment, what we're going to be talking about on the pod today is, Nurget's had a 40-year run with very few challengers to the throne. And today we're going to focus on really his only major adversary in his reign as godfather of the Canadian Hells Angels, and that is Scott Steiner, who was a United States-born biker that came over to Canada as a teen and was just a hurricane of hubris, a typhoon of swagger and a tsunami of confidence and intelligence and balls, very brash, very bold, and was one of these guys that very easily we could be talking about him right now the way we talk about Nurget. Nurget theoretically could have been on the losing side of that rivalry. And it was in the first decade of Nurget's reign, took over in the late 80s, and Scott Steiner emerged on the scene in the Quebec Hells Angels scene, out of Montreal, South Chapter, Sorel, in the early 90s. But by the mid 90s, Scott Steiner was very powerful and very vocal in his desire to unseat Nurget Stadnick. And we know Nurget is based out of Hamilton. He patched in, though, through the Sorel chapter in Montreal, but, headquarters out of his hometown in Hamilton. And Steinert was able to get in really good, really tight with some legendary Montreal Hells Angels. And we'll get into that. Mom Boucher, Tiny Richard. So I'm going to break down who Scott Steiner was, his rise in the Hells Angels and in the Canadian underworld, and how his rivalry, quasi-war with Nurget Stadnick ended in his demise. But it was definitely a wild ride, a roller coaster of emotions and violence and power and ambition. So let's kind of get into it. Steinert was born in Wisconsin. His dad worked as an executive at a paper company, got transferred from the U.S. office in Wisconsin to an office in Montreal when Steinert was 14 or 15, I believe. And Steinert comes over to Canada, comes over to Montreal, and immediately from his teen years. He has a very strong personality, and he's always been, he always was a lightning rod. People either loved him or hated him. At the end, more people hated him than loved him, and that spelled doom for him in a very gruesome fashion. But he, live fast, die young. That was Scott Steiner. It went by the nicknames TNT, Scotty Sensation. He was a explosive expert. That's why they called him TNT. And he ran a escort company called Sensations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He had a lot of authentic confidence, and a high IQ, but he also had a renegade streak. He wasn't a rule follower, and from a young age, he's being a scofflaw, being a teenage delinquent, selling drugs, breaking into houses, gets kicked out of high school. Eventually, at the end of his teen years, in the late 1970s, he is kicked out of his house. His dad and mom kick him out of the house, and he leaves Montreal, goes to British Columbia, and knocks around BC for a while in the early 80s. Continued the wild child antics in Vancouver, but doesn't really make much of an impact there. And he's drawn back to Montreal in around August 1985. And at that point, he's dealing drugs in Montreal, goes to jail for a couple years for narcotics trafficking and possession of stolen property. He's released in 1987 and gets back on good terms with his father, who at that point had moved back to the United States. And his father gives him money and invests in a home insulation company. But at the same time, he's plying his trade in the underworld, and he's selling steroids and selling drugs and doing collections for loan sharks that are connected to the Catronis. That's the Mafia in Montreal, the era before the Rizzutos. And the Catronis still held power with their faction even after the Rizzutos ascended in the late 70s, and the Catronis still held some weight into the 2000s to a degree. So he wasn't aligned with the Rizzutos, but he was connected to the Catronis, and he was doing collections for Catroni-backed bookmakers and loan sharks. He goes back to prison for a year on a parole violation, and in those couple years in prison, he learns to speak French, becomes bilingual, and that really helps him a lot in his future endeavors in the Canadian underworld. And he comes out of prison, and by late 89, 90, he's fallen under the tutelage of Robert Rochard, a.k.a. Tiny. And Tiny Richard is one of those guys that needs no introduction in 81 circles. In Quebec, he was a very feared and respected guy, and he took Steinert under his wing and helped Steinert get quickly up the ladder. And he didn't have to become a hang around. He jumped right to prospect status, skipped the first level of finding your way into becoming a full patch in a motorcycle club, and eventually gets patched in the 1990s. Tiny Richard sponsors him, and he gets in. He's not just in good with Tiny Richard. He becomes very close and trusted by Maurice Mom Boucher, who was the face of the Montreal Hell's Angels from the mid to late '80s all the way to the early 2000s when he was locked up for good. And Mom Boucher was the guy was a force of nature and had a lot of vision and a lot of charisma and a lot of bloodthirst. And Steinert, and he was also highly intelligent. And Steinert connected with that. And even though Tiny Richard ushered Steinert into the Hells Angels, it was really his close relationship with Mom Boucher that allowed him to get as powerful as he did. Mom Boucher was the boss of Montreal and was in the 1990s leading, was a war general leading the Hells Angels in the Great Quebec Biker War against the Rock Machine for control of the cocaine industry. And Scott Steiner becomes Mom Boucher's right-hand man, top enforcer and top hitman during the first part of the Great Quebec Biker War. He is somebody that has a very eclectic, Steinert has an eclectic personality. He can be very unhinged and emotional, but he was also very disciplined in his day-to-day life. He wasn't a hard partier. He was very focused on making a lot of money and gaining a lot of power in the Hells Angels, more so than partying. Not to say that he couldn't party, he did party, but kept it close to the vest and was the type of guy that was in bed at 9, 10 o'clock at night and waking up at 6, 7 in the morning tending to his businesses. He's also known for somebody that will stand up to the Rizzutos and not get muscled, not get intimidated. He turned away some deals with the Rizzutos allegedly, and also was able to rebuff some attempts by New York La Cosa Nostra that wanted to partner with him with some of his prostitution rackets. So that added to his reputation that he was somebody that wouldn't be taken advantage of, and even people with big organized crime resumes weren't going to get him to stand down. And he starts to leverage that reputation and immediately begins taking that reputation outside of his lane and expanding his personal rackets. And that starts to cause issues almost, from the time that he gets the juice and fits in there as Mom Boucher's most trusted assassin. He's stepping on a lot of toes, and Mom Boucher was doing a lot of politicking for Scotty Steiner. And it starts with these two rivalries, one with Nurget Stadnick, who's the national president, and then another rivalry with David the Wolf Carroll, who is the boss of the Halifax Hells Angels and a member of the Nomads. We'll get into the Nomads in a moment. But, you start to have a scenario where lines are being drawn, and you can tell eventually this town might not be big enough for the both of them. And when I say town, I mean country, and that Steiner wanted to become the president of the Hells Angels in Canada. Nurget Stadnick was the president of the Hells Angels in Canada. They weren't seeing each other a lot on a day-to-day basis because, again, Nurget is in Ontario and Hamilton, and Steinert's in Montreal. But there's bad blood right off the bat. And then it gets accelerated when one of Nurget's main bodyguards, collectors, enforcers, Bam Bam Magnuson, jump ship from Nurget's camp and goes with Scott Steiner, and Steinert and Magnuson become business partners in legitimate stuff and business partners in crime. And Magnuson is a very feared enforcer, assassin, a guy that when you wouldn't want to run into him in a dark alley. But eventually by 94, 95, you wouldn't, out and about in Quebec in social circles or business circles, you wouldn't see one without the other. Scott Steiner and Bam Bam Magnuson became a duo, a 1-2 punch. And, he's a cowboy, just like Steinert is. And they were two bulls in a china shop. And in terms of Nurget and Steinert, those were just two alphas that appeared to be on a collision course. He's getting all of the main contracts, all the most high priority enforcement assignments and murder contracts in the war with the Rock Machine when it kicks off in 94, 95, 96. He's getting a lot of that work from Mom Boucher. The beginning of the end for him in terms of his power in the Hells Angels, and it would, and I'll explain what I mean in a second, is what happens in August of 1995 and the accidental murder of an 11-year-old boy, Daniel DeRoche. And this was about a year into the war, and Mom Boucher and Scott Steiner concoct a plan to gain sympathy from the press or the public, and they want to make it look like they're under attack by the Rock Machine, and that it's more of an assault on them than a tit for tat war. They think they can somehow convince the police or the public to turn on the Rock Machine, as opposed to the narrative that had developed in the press at that time, that the Rock Machine were these like scrappy underdog Robin Hoods, facing off the David versus Goliath against the monster biker club brand Hells Angels. So they decide to sacrifice one of their own, a guy named Mark Dubé, who was a Hells Angel drug dealer affiliate, and Scott Steiner blows up this guy's Jeep, kills him, but the shrapnel from the bomb ricochets and ends up killing DeRoche, who was playing on his bicycle down the street. And this just, it gets a tremendous amount of bad press, and all of the concept that they could somehow leverage press in the murder of Dubé in their favor completely backfires, and all the press is negative, and people are looking for someone to blame, not just the public and the law enforcement, people within the Hells Angels. And this, as Steinert is trying to mount a rebellion, an insurrection, if you will, and challenge Nurget Stadnick, this pushes him back on the board. And it was really, like I said, it was the beginning of the end. It made it so it was kind of insurmountable for him to maneuver Nurget out of the way. He didn't, like I said, he was a hurricane of hubris. He didn't, he thought very highly of himself, and it didn't dissuade him. But it was more than just Nurget Stadnick, more, in terms of a situation that needed more attention, more urgency than the issue with Stadnick, because Stadnick was proximity wise, he wasn't running into Stadnick everywhere he went. He started to bump heads with him in some territory disputes, and we'll get into that in a moment. But they weren't necessarily running in the same circles. That wasn't the case with David the Wolf Carroll, who, although he ran the Nova Scotia Hells Angels faction in Halifax. For business purposes, he moved to Montreal and into the mountains of outside of Montreal, and started expanding his Hells Angel empire. And Wolf Carroll is just an utterly fascinating character that will be the third part of this trilogy. We're going to deep dive Wolf Carroll and whatever happened to him. He's still on the run from the government a quarter century later. A guy with a lot of bodies and a lot of influence in Hells Angels circles globally, probably to this day. But he's been a fugitive for 25 years, and we're going to kind of get into the mystery behind Wolf Carroll in our next podcast, or one of our next podcasts. But Wolf Carroll didn't get along with Mom's Boy, and Mom's Boy. It didn't matter that Scott Steiner was in Mom Boucher's good graces when he kept on creating scenarios where he was on the outs with Nurget. He's on the outs with Wolf Carroll. He gets into a dispute with Sky Langlois, one of the founding fathers of the Montreal Hells Angels. So he might have had, Mom Boucher's ear and sympathy for Mom Boucher, but Mom Boucher could only keep the wolves at bay for so long. And the stuff with Wolf Carroll and Nurget really begin to go into like the stratosphere in terms of how big the rivalry was, how intense it was, how many scenarios were being created where they were infringing on each other's territories. And with Wolf Carroll with Wolf Carroll, it had to do with the prostitution racket. Him and Steinert didn't get along, and they were both competing for all the high-level prostitutes, not just in Montreal, but in Toronto and in Ottawa, parts of Hamilton and Winnipeg, Halifax, the east side of Montreal. And that created a big issue. Wolf Carroll had been there a lot longer and had ingratiated himself with a lot more people, mainly Nurget Stadnick, than Scott Steiner had. Scott Steiner was still in a lot of Hells Angels circles looked at as an outsider, a carpetbagger. He was an American. He was continually fighting deportation orders, and in some cases extradition orders, to get for the crown trying to get rid of him. And it was always something that was a detriment to fully getting the support of all of the Canadian Hells Angels. He had a small group of people behind him that were very loyal to him, but overall, he was alienating the most powerful guys in the club in Canada. So Scott Steiner didn't care. That was his attitude. He thought he was above it all, and that by power of personality, power of his will, power of his strength, because he was a hitman just like Wolf Carroll was. He felt like he could go body to body with, body to body. You drop 10, I'll drop 15, and that's the attitude that they had. Steinert starts to not just infringe on Wolf Carroll, but he's infringing on Nurget Stadnick out in Winnipeg. And then there's some other Ontario outlets that Steinert is going into: Toronto, Kitchener, Kingston, and it's becoming an issue with Stadnick, Carroll, and Langlois. Around this time, he decides to make a big purchase because he's making a lot of money. Steinert's, and that's another way that he's keeping Mom Boucher loyal to him, is that he's giving Mom Boucher big envelopes. And he's not just killing people for Montboucher and the war effort. He's feeding his pockets because he dabbled in everything. Steinert was a kind of a serial entrepreneur in terms of the underworld, and he has this idea to purchase what became known as the La Viguier mansion, and use the mansion as kind of a headquarters and a place to run prostitution out of, run some gambling out of. He was running pornography rackets, having porn films and photo shoots held at the mansion, and not sharing any of this with anyone besides Montboucher. And this caused issues. For people that aren't in Canada that are watching this in the United States, I had to look this up myself. The La Viguier mansion was a part of the real life tabloid sensation that was the La Viguier family, who won the Quebec lottery. It was kind of like a real life Canadian Beverly Hillbillies, for the analogy to the U.S. consumers here. They were think of like the family from like Shameless with William H. Macy, and if they won the lottery. So it was this very blue collar, poor white French Canadian family that won like $10 million, and it eventually tore the family apart. They lost all the money. They were in the tabloids, and it became a big deal, like in Canadian pop culture. So eventually they have to sell this gaudy mansion, and Scott Steiner takes it off the market and starts running a lot of rackets out of there. The DeRoche killing, the killing of the 11-year-old boy, is just something that Steinert can never get past. And it's something that Nurget and Wolf Carroll would use against him and weaponize it. It brought so much bad publicity. It brought so much law enforcement heat. And based on people I spoke to, Scott Steiner was just mortified that and I don't think he gave a shit that an 11-year-old kid got killed. Honestly, I think he was mad at the repercussions from an 11-year-old kid getting killed. Just like with the mansion, he was getting a lot of grief from people in the Hells Angels that didn't like him doing what he was doing at the mansion, but it didn't have anything to do with them judging the morality of it, or really having worries about the high profile nature of it. It was that they weren't seeing a piece of it. Therefore, they didn't like it. And you get into a situation where you're continually alienating yourself from people that are very powerful and very violent. And then you have the government coming after you, trying to deport you. And then there's a couple things that are kind of the final nails in the coffin, but definitely one of the big ones was Steinert and Magnuson. Just as, the waves are crashing onto shore, they've got all the major Hells Angels besides Montboucher angry at them, looking to undermine and diminish them. And instead of peeling back and turning to diplomacy, Scott Steinert and Bam Bam Magnuson, they double and triple down. And they start moving into parts of the Montreal North Shore, Laval, start moving into some parts of Hamilton where Nurget is based, and just really tempting fate. And simultaneously, government's coming like a freight train trying to kick them out of the country. The fact that he wasn't being kicked out of the country, was causing rumors within the Hells Angels that he was cooperating. I can't definitively say yes or no on that. I know that there was a rat that was connected to both Steinert and Wolf Carroll, a guy named Danny Boy Kane, who was a go-between for them, was a hitman, drug dealer, big-time confidential informant. And a lot of the information that Danny Boy Kane was sharing with the government was, I think, intentionally making it look like it could have been coming from Steinert and Magnuson. Now, Steiner and Magnuson might have been cooperating too, but some of the stuff that they were getting questioned on were tips that weren't coming from them. And I'll get into more specific in a second. But Scott Steiner has to seriously think about what he will do if he's kicked out of the country. And him and Mom Boucher go shopping for a landing spot, and they go to Mexico and they go to Cuba, and they're looking for other spots. Even in the United States, they're thinking Hawaii. If he had to go to the U.S., he starts scheming to maybe join a Native American tribe in Canada. Steinert does to somehow find a way out of the deportation. Eventually, he does what seems to be the simplest way to solve this problem. He marries a woman from Quebec and has a kid with her. He gets naturalized. And some of the, I guess, questions about whether or not he was staving off deportation because he was cooperating get pushed to the wayside. But there are a couple other things that start to pave the way for his brutal downfall, Scott Steiner's and Bam Bam Magnuson's. One of them is Mom Boucher is creating the Nomads, which is the subunit within the Hells Angels in that has kind of carte blanche. They don't have any geographic location that they're tied to. They can be nomadic, roam around the country, and swing their big stick, influence, rape, pillage, and so forth. And then even from within the Nomads, he creates a subgroup called the La Table. That was horrible. I butchered that. The Table. And in both of these subunit creations that have a prestige factor to them, Scott Steiner is excluded. And Mom Boucher, even if he had wanted to, Steinert was being blocked by Stadnick, Lingua, and Wolf Carroll. So at a certain point, I think Steinert realized that he wasn't going to be able to mount an insurrection and just kind of says, I'm going to go for it all on my own. And that's when he starts moving in like on the North Shore and Winnipeg and parts of Hamilton that are just direct fuck yous to the big boss man, Nurget Stadnick. And Wolf Carroll becomes Nurget's, his weapon of choice in the war against Steinert, because Carroll and Steinert start bumping heads on a regular basis out in public. Steinert counters La Table and the Nomads and creates his own group that was known as the Group of Five or the Fist. And it's like his own inner circle, elite paramilitary organization within the Hells Angels. And it's kind of only a matter of time at this point that he meets the maker. And Mom Boucher could only keep the sharks from devouring him for so long. And so the two final nails in the proverbial coffin come with Bam Bam Magnuson getting into a fight with Leo Rizzuto. Now Leo Rizzuto is the Don of the Rizzuto mob, the Montreal Mafia. Back when this happened in the winter of 97, he was a prince who had at that time, no future in the crime family. He was in law school. His dad, Vito, and his grandpa, Zio and Nicolo, were the patriarchs and didn't want him to go into the life. We all know things have changed in the 30 years since. Now, in his 50s, he's running the crime family, but back in his 20s, he was just a law student. And him and Bam Bam Magnuson got into it at a nightclub, and Bam Bam Magnuson beat him up badly, knocked him out in the alley behind the bar, and the Rizzutos started pressing the Hells Angels to kill Magnuson and Steiner. They already didn't like Steinert. And when Monboucher had gone away to serve a short prison sentence, I think for some type of parole violation or a contempt, I'm not exactly sure, but he was gone for about a year in 95, 96. And there was this drought, this cocaine drought. And it was because Steiner. I mean, it was Vito Rizzuto who was working with Monboucher, would not work with Steinert. So again, Steinert's just alienating himself continually and making so many enemies, and just out of thinking that his power of personality or his power of persuasion could get him out of it was his overconfidence talking. The confidence had turned over to cockiness, and from cockiness to recklessness. And then there's this big drug shipment that's seized. It has a lot of ecstasy, marijuana, some cocaine, and it's seized in the port. And there's a lot of people that think the tip for the seizure, because Nurget and Sky Langlois and Wolf Carroll, and this was their score, they thought that or one of the things that they hypothesized was that the bust had come on a tip from Steinert and Magnuson. It turns out that wasn't the case. Danny Boy Kane was the one who tipped them off to that bust, but it's like the final straw. And it's about 10 months after Bam Bam Magnuson gets into the fight with Leo Rizzuto, and Magnuson and Scotty Steiner are summoned to a meeting at the Sorel chapter clubhouse by Monboucher. And at this point, Monboucher's hands were tied, and Steiner had gone so far off the reservation that Boucher had to get on board with the murder contract. And Stadnick was, in kind of one fell swoop, going to eliminate any loose ends to his vice grip on the Canadian Hells Angels by getting rid of Scott Steiner. So November 4th, 1997, Steinert and Magnuson leave the mansion to go to a meeting they never come home from. And according to confidential informants and court records, they were beaten to death with hammers and bats, their skulls caved in and thrown in the St. Lawrence River. They were found in the coming years, but as of November 97, by Thanksgiving 97, well, I guess Thanksgiving in the U.S., I think Thanksgiving in Canada is in October, so maybe I'm wrong. But by the holidays in 97, Scott Steiner was no longer living and breathing. He was no longer a threat to Nurget Stadnick. And since then, for the last 30 years, Nurget Stadnick has reigned, or last 28 years, 27 years, last 28 years has reigned unchallenged, unfettered. But wanted to tell the story of the American, the U.S. resident who was born and raised on U.S. soil that came over to Canada and caused a commotion and almost ended up taking over the entire country's Hells Angel empire, but was blocked by Kaiser Soze of the biker world himself, Nurget Stadnick, Walter Stadnick, and that just added more to the mythology, to the mystique. So check back in later this week or early next week for a Wolf Carroll kind of bio and breakdown of the mystery surrounding his disappearance and how he rose up the ranks of the Hells Angels out of Nova Scotia. So check that out. He's like a urban legend, urban myth, like the Boogeyman or the Slender Man or he's just this superhero villain, Wolf Carroll, in terms of how many bodies he has, in terms of the viciousness, in terms of his intelligence, and ultimately because of his ability to evade arrest for the last quarter century. So check back in and get some, the final component to this trilogy, Canadian biker boss gods, legends, myths, and mysteries. I'm Scott Burnstein. Please like, share, and subscribe. Original Gangsters Podcast, uncovering the underworld, one city, one region, one country at a time.